Perfect. So, finishing up the day with the testing. This is going to be interesting. So, I'm going to talk about what makes a test good and what makes a test bad. And I think the best way to start, seeing as it's 17:30 now, is with an example. So this happened to me about a year ago. So I got to work early Monday morning. I pulled the changes from Friday, and I ran the tests. It doesn't look very good. So it failed. Kim is not happy. So war mode. This is not okay. But I start looking into the problem, and Jenkins, our build server that also ran the tests, is green. Come on. This is not a good way to start a Monday morning at 7 a.m. So before I go on talking more about the actual test that failed in this case, I'm just going to take a basic introduction to JavaScript testing. So this is a test written using Jasmine, which is a very well-used JavaScript testing library. So here we have a test for a cart, so a shopping cart, where we have a test for calculating the total price. So we see that describe, here we have a suite of tests, and it is the actual test here. So it calculates the total price. So within there, we create a cart, we add a couple of items, and then we expect something. So here we expect that the total price is some value. We can also define functions to run before and after each test. Often we call them, so here in Jasmine, they're called before each and after each. We often just call them setup and teardown when we talk about them. We can also nest describes within each other. So here, this is the same test as we saw on the last slide. It's just written differently. So we have a before each, the outer before each, where we create a cart, and then an inner before each here within the inner subscribe that adds a couple of items to it, and then the test that runs. So that's just about it. Now you know Jasmine. So back to my failing test and Monday morning. The first thing we see here is that the error, the header or the title of the test, is that an order with life insurance with child insurance validates. Quite hard to understand what that means at all. So it's vague. We look at the actual error message here. It says that expected false to be true. So instead of returning true, something returned false. Then we look at this mess of lines, the stack trace, and we finally find the file that contains the test. So looking at the test, it's basically the same as it said. Something here, the order was supposed to be valid, but it's not. I have no idea what this means. So it's really hard to understand here why should it validate? What is order? So we can go to the nearest before each. Here we create a product and we add it to a cart. CI means child insurance. I know this because I was working on the shopping cart. This is for an insurance company. But there's nothing here working with order, so I'm not quite sure what's happening. So I still don't know why it failed. Now I'm starting to get quite angry. I don't understand anything. So I go to the next before each. So this is one step up. There's more stuff going on. We create a new product. We add it to the cart. We set the policy holder. We add a couple of beneficiaries. This is a life insurance, LI. And I still don't understand anything. And then, so this before each was for about 10 to 15 tests within that scribe. The next one was for the entire file. So 55 tests or something, share the same before each. There's so much crazy going on here, I have no idea. So after debugging this for an hour at least, so it's now about 8 a.m. Monday morning, I find the problem, this number. In Norway, you use the social security number to calculate someone's age. And the problem was that the test data, one day you had to reach the point where it tips over. So this test person went from being 14 to 15 years old. He was now too old to have this insurance. What? So this is the moment when you start hating your tests. And this is why this is an important topic. We can talk as much as we want about Jasmine versus Mocha versus whatever other testing library. If you don't write good tests, it's going to be an amazing pain to work with. So it's going to cost you just a crazy amount of hours to debug and understand what's going on. And then it kind of defeats the purpose. This is what the backend guys have been learning for a long time, that we front-end guys now have to learn and understand. So we need to learn more about writing tests, not writing tests using Jasmine or using some other library. We need to understand more about what is a good test in itself. And before we can go into how a test should look like and what we should do and shouldn't do, we need to understand why we actually test. So this question is often ignored, or we talk about it way too late. So we usually, on my teams, we usually talk about this early in the development. And one of the main reasons is that testing in production sucks. I love this GIF. This is why you test. And seriously, it depends. And that's why it's important to talk about it. So to understand why I test and how I do it, I first need to say a little bit about how I work. So my name is Kim. You can find me on Twitter. And I'm a consultant in Norway. And that means that I usually work in teams of 5 to 10 persons for 3 months to a couple of years. And the thing is, I usually work with interactive and complex applications. I work for some of the biggest companies in Norway on often very domain-heavy applications. These are often very complex applications that we need to understand. So if you work on a library, if you work on something that is mostly, for example, animations and other things like that on the front end, it might be different. So it's important to understand why you actually test. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about philosophy. So philosophy about testing. I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific techniques that I use. And I'm going to try to share some experiences, both good and bad. So the question is, why do I test? And to me, there are primarily 3 reasons. I want to avoid regressions, and I want to improve communication and design. So I'll just go through them in order. So first up, we're now building more complex and interactive applications. JavaScript has become an amazing language. The speed has just been, it's great now. So we can build more complex applications, more interesting solutions. But we often work in larger teams, so there's more people working on the front end. Before, I was maybe the only guy. On my team right now, we're 4 or 5 people working a lot on the front end. And I want to be less afraid of changing code. The problem is that when you work in a team of 4 to 5 people, there's a lot of code there. And I'm not sure if I can change this, what happens? Do I need to go in the browser and refresh every page to see? And especially this, less afraid of changing other people's code. This is important to me. And I also hate debugging in production. So what's going on with this crazy setup? You get like, it fails for me in Firefox, it fails for me in IE, it fails for me in Chrome, and no other information. And I want to be able to fix a bug once. So instead of fixing it and then it fails at some other point. The next thing is that I want to improve communication. And one thing that I saw happen a lot of times was that I did something, a complex feature, and then half a year afterwards, I said, why did we do it like this? I'm not entirely sure about all the details here. And what should the code actually do? Because sometimes you might not remember, you might disagree, because people remember a little bit differently. So this really helps communication. And that's an important thing for me as a consultant, because I'm on a project for maybe just 3 months, and then someone else has to take that code base and add new features to it. And lastly, it helps improve my design. It gives me immediate feedback, so when I write the test, I can immediately see that something worked or didn't work. And it actually helped me keep the code simpler. That's my experience, at least. So these are the 3 primary reasons why I test. The problem, though, is that it's really easy to write bad tests. I have written so many bad tests. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to try to focus on how I write my tests now. So first up, focus on the reader. This was the main problem we saw in the first test, in the example, was that it was written by someone just to ensure that it worked, but he hadn't thought about, okay, what happens if it fails? And usually, especially in the team, time spent reading code is greater than time spent writing code. And I see this all the time in teams. I use a lot of time reading other people's code. This is not a bad thing. This is what you have to expect when you're working on a bigger team. But the thing is now, the first time you meet a failing test, it's usually someone else's test that failed that you now have to debug and try to understand. And that's really hard. So first up for me, no setup. So I don't use before each at all and after each. Try to stay away from that. People usually do this because they want to dry up the code. But I think a little duplication isn't a problem. It's more important to actually understand what's going on. So what we've been talking about in my team is drawing up lines. Just these lines are similar, so we need to have them in the same place, versus drawing up concepts. So here we're creating an order, we're creating a cart, we're creating a user, we're creating a logged in user. These are concepts that we can put on the same place, but just lines that look similar, don't think that's a good reason to have them in a setup. And I think this is a good way of looking at it. You want to create tiny universes with minimal conceptual overhead. So now, because it's about understanding the test when you're debugging it. And just don't be afraid of the duplication. It's not actually a problem. And one good way of handling this, I've found, is creation helpers. So the test that we saw earlier could be written like this instead. So here, I've tried to have a better title. I also have what I call creation helpers here. Create order, where I can pass in a cart and a policyholder. We see that I create a cart that contains one item, the child insurance. I create a policyholder, age 14, and I can see that it's valid or not. Now, everything that we went looking for is now within this test. It doesn't use any state outside of this test. So, and now it's also very easy to add the other test. It shouldn't be valid when the user is 15. So we don't do a lot of stuff with social security numbers, and there's not a lot of stuff happening that we don't see immediately when the test fails. So now this creation helper helps us fix the social security number and everything. So we have these creation helpers that have good defaults. Next up is revealing intent. So for example here, what are we testing? What does it mean to validate? This is the thing that we need to really state there in the test, so that the next time we come back to that test, we understand what validate means. Because that next time might be 3 months in the future, maybe a year, and you won't remember it, especially in a more complex application. So here, we should focus on why, not how. So that it just validates, it's not enough to understand why it validates. And it needs to be deterministic. It needs to return the same result every time you run that test. Otherwise, we're in this place. So where crazy stuff is happening, you need to go in and try to understand why is this happening. And the next thing is that tests need to be very simple. So the test that we saw earlier, it was reasonably simple. It was just that things were placed in before each, and it was hard to understand what was going on. Next up is tests where you have for loops, you have if, you have while, those kind of things is not a good thing to have in tests. For example here, we have, so these are timestamps for events. They're supposed to show midnight or noon, if it's that time of the day the event starts. Otherwise, it's supposed to show hours and minutes. This is one way of testing this. So here, we loop through the minutes of the day. We create a new date, we create an event with that date, and then we can just see that it actually does the right thing. Can anyone spot the bug? I didn't hear what you say, but the thing is, here, that over there, that's seconds. So its date takes in year, month, something, but the third to last is minutes, the second to last is seconds. So the thing is, instead of looping through the entire day, we now loop through the first 24 minutes of the day. So the noon test isn't even run, but you can't see that because the test library doesn't know that you are supposed to loop through the entire day. So this test run, thankfully this is a reasonably simple thing, but if this is more complex, what's actually the output here, you can have bugs that are never discovered because they are not run. And here, I've tried to create the same test using a creation helper. So here you see create date, where I only need to specify hours and minutes instead. So now it's easier to understand and see that these tests are actually run and that they work, and that we also have a test for noon and one for midnight. So we need to see tests fail. So many have maybe heard about test-driven development. I'm not saying that you should follow test-driven development. I don't always do that myself. But you still need to see a test actually fail. So here's an example of a test that always runs. So here we have a music player. It has a count of done songs or finished songs. And it is supposed to increase when a song is finished. So here I just try to reload and try to change this count. And now it's supposed to fail. It still runs. And we try to change it again, still runs. So something strange is going on here. The thing is, async tests need to tell when they're done. So if we haven't seen this fail, it will always run. Magic test. That's not a good thing. So now we see it failed. So remember that the most important thing your tests do after they're written is actually failing when they're supposed to fail. Otherwise, what's the point? Then you can just delete all your tests and go home. You don't need tests if they don't fail. And that's also one of the reasons why you need to be aware of async. Not all testing libraries are strict enough on this, so it's easy to have tests that appear to be running but aren't, and then you find crazy bugs in production that your tests say actually should work, and you're in for this half-a-day debugging session with lots of crazy stuff. So this is a very important thing to think about. So the next thing that I try to be strict on, I'm not always good enough at this, is to follow this pattern. So inside a test, so again, no setup. Inside a test, first set up things, so arrange things. So here I create a cart, then I act on that cart, add a couple of items, and then I assert something on the state of the cart. So here, for example, the total price is supposed to be correct. Sometimes you might skip act because everything is part of the arrange step, but try to follow this way of thinking. And I also try to keep it to one assertion, so one expect per test. It's easier to understand what's going on. It's easier to write a good explanation at the top. But perhaps most importantly, and it comes from all the other things I've been talking about, tests should be stupidly simple. They should be amazingly simple. Because what happens when you don't understand the test yourself and you need to go on this debugging crazy stuff? And I think this is a good way of thinking about it. Write tests that you'd be happy to debug yourself 6 months down the line or a year down the line, because you will meet so many bad tests that you will try to focus on this. So that's basically the things that are most important to me when I write my tests. Next step is looking at the things that happen after a test is written. So as soon as your test is finished, that's part of maintenance now. Now you need to maintain that test. Because poor quality tests, like the one we saw in the beginning, can slow development to a crawl. When you use 2 hours debugging what should be very simple, it starts taking a lot of time. And you should try to feel the pain. So if it feels painful, you should fix it. So if you have to go looking for that bug for hours on end, fix the problem and talk about it, especially in a team setting. It's important to talk about the problem, try to find things that work for the team. Also, we tend to focus on refactoring our code, our application code, but you also need to refactor the tests. You need to treat your tests as you treat your application code. And especially if you have a lot of tests. So I often, and I've been telling this a lot of times myself, that we have like 3-to-1 testing versus application code. The problem is that if you have 5,000 lines of code in your application, you suddenly have 15,000 lines of tests. And if you don't maintain them well, it's going to be such a pain to work with. And it's also, don't focus on having that much tests. Having just some line number, it's not anything that we should think about. We should think about testing the areas we are most worried about going wrong. So the most complex code we should test, the simple code, maybe not. But we should think about what is the cost of testing and what is the value. So tests need to provide value. We can't just write them, stow them away someplace, and not handle them at all. And I think we need to be less driven by dogma. We tend to say that everything needs to have a test. We need to have 100% coverage. We need to have something crazy. We need to have so and so many tests. And we need to do TDD. We need to do all kind of stuff. But I don't think we need to do all the things. We need to focus on creating really good tests that give value to the team and don't slow us down. Because I think testing can be a very good thing, but it can also be a very painful experience. So we shouldn't accept tests that we can't understand ourselves half a year down the line. We should focus on keeping them simple. And testing can be awesome. Testing can be a great experience. But we need to focus on how we can increase the value of each and every test we have. So that's the most important things for me when it comes to maintenance. So in the end, to me, a beautiful test doesn't necessarily have a definitive answer. It depends on the team, it depends on the setting, it depends on the complexity of the project. But here's some of the things that I tend to think about. I want fast tests that fail when they should be understandable, they should reveal intent, always return the same result, focused on the reader, and so on. These are good things to think about. So this is why I think that focusing only on a testing library, only on using Karma or TestDem or whatever project or whatever library you're using, it's not the most important thing. Actually, getting value from your tests is the most important thing. So focus on the craft, not the tools. And you should absolutely fuss about your tests. You should keep them simple. You should talk about them in the team. And don't let them deteriorate. Don't let them be this horrible part of the code base that no one touches. They need to run all the time. Make it really simple to run your tests all the time. And they need to be run in your build process. So if you have Jenkins, usually if you're a Java project or something, you have Jenkins. A failing test should fail your build. Then you will focus on the tests. And then or if it fails and you don't want to have that test anymore, delete it. That's also an okay thing. So if you want to learn more about how to treat your tests, I recommend these 4 sources. These are very good. And that was that. Thanks.